Manager for MySQL products. I joined MySQL when it was a small Scandinavian company, and then we got bought by Sun, and then we got bought by Oracle 5 years ago. And my job is to go out and evangelize MySQL products. Our unit president says MySQL will be the database of choice for the PHP world, and we'll do everything we can to keep it there. And before I go too much further, I'd like to have you folks acknowledge the folks like Stratus over here and all the other folks in the orange shirts who put on this event. They do an amazing job. It looks easy, but believe me, they're doing a lot of work behind the scenes that you don't see. So if you get a chance to thank them one-on-one, please do so. Another part of my job, besides the evangelism, is to be a lightning rod. So if you have any complaints, criticisms, gripes, bitches, or just what the heck is Oracle doing, questions about MySQL, give them to me, and I'll take them to upper management. Upper management doesn't really show like it's concerned, but they sweat over every piece of criticism I bring in. If you need to get a hold of me, my email is up there. I'll have the slides up on slideshare.net. I'll have that link up at the end of this. And my Twitter handle is Stoker, but I got to warn you, there's a Nicole Kidman movie that came out about a year ago. So if you see past tweets about red hair, nudity, and adventure, it's unfortunately not me. Some of the things I'm talking about with the upcoming release of MySQL 5.7 haven't been carved in stone yet. So if I say something's blue, and you're thinking sky blue, and I'm thinking robin's eggs blue, and it ends up being kind of a Stuart Tartan, take everything I say about future products with a grain of salt, please. So what has Oracle been doing with MySQL? Well, when they bought us, they looked at us and went through our metrics and said, you're doing great here, but you need more help here. Go out and buy some engineers. So with our new engineers, we've been going out and producing code. The funny thing is, in the old days, we used to over-promise and under-deliver. In the past 5 years, we've been over-delivering and under-promising. And as you can see, we've been kind of busy. So actually, about 17 months ago now, MySQL 5.6 went GA. It was better performing, scales better. We've been refactoring a lot of the code for InnoDB because that's the storage engine that 99.9% of you use. To do that, we've been redoing the optimizer. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Really tried to shore up replication. And we've added a couple NoSQL features that I'll talk about in detail later that are actually up to 9 times faster than straight SQL on the same data. We also were talking to a lot of the Unix distro folks, and their big problem is the folks who manage the packages have a full-time job. Like Luke was talking about earlier, they have a part-time job that they're doing. They probably have kids, and they probably like this thing called sleep, and they probably try to do it every night. So we said, well, it'd be much easier for you folks if we just rolled our own repository. So if you want the latest and greatest stuff in a DEB or a YUM format or a RPM format, we have it out there for just about everybody, and that's almost all our products out there. So, 5.7. MySQL's come a long way from the first time I downloaded 3.2.3. But one of the things that our engineers love to do is really try to crank the performance on the newer machines. And I don't really like showing graphs like this in a presentation because none of you are going to go out and put in a new database just because one line is bigger than another line. But this I use just to show that our engineers are really performance maniacs. They're looking at how they can squeeze stuff out and keep things reliable. So, MySQL copied the precedent that Oracle started many years ago of having a cost-based optimizer. You send your query in, the optimizer looks at it and says, well, what's the cheapest way I can do this? And cheapness was declared on the number of disk IOs it took to perform the query. Well, that was a good standard for many, many years that's finally beginning to die. For those of you who are not running Fusion IO cards in the future, you'll probably run a variant of it. It's an atomic write. MySQL currently with InnoDB writes everything twice, so in case there's a crash, there's at least one good copy around. But now that you have an atomic write, you don't need to double buffer things. So, with that said, I started talking to disk drive vendors and saying, well, what's going to be hanging off my box 2, 3, 5 years from now? And they don't know. They expect it's going to be a bunch of hybrid type stuff, super SSDs, all sorts of super fast spinning drives. So the idea of trying to do something off a simple metric such as I/O from a disk is kind of going by the wayside. So we're coming up with a optimizer you can tune for doing stuff off faster devices, or if you have stuff on a slower device, say like on a data warehouse, but you still want to mix it with other stuff, how to properly mix and match. Data dictionary. Data dictionaries are really important if you're grabbing stuff from one database and another database and moving together. It's great for a lot of metadata information. The important part for most of you here is we're going to get rid of the .frm files. They're kind of a legacy thing from the early days, and they're kind of messy, and they're easy to damage, and if you do damage one, it's hard to restore it, and you end up doing some nasty stuff to get it going. Fabric. 2 years ago at OSCON, we were talking to Facebook and say, what's your biggest pain in the butt? And they said sharding and high availability. So we came up with a set of Python scripts that came out last May that are free, that will let you shard stuff and reshard stuff on the fly. It'll also let you have clusters of servers for high availability. There's a little bit more on that later. So why is that important? Well, right now, we're going through a transition in the server world where we used to name servers and give them cute names because they're kind of like pets. Well, now with OpenStack and AWS and a whole bunch of other things, our servers are becoming more like cattle. We don't really have a name for them. They have a serial number that we address them by for our own things, but they're not the cute little toy anymore. They're something we're going to slaughter later if we don't like them. For those of you who are in big Oracle shops, the folks who do write Uncle Larry those checks with 5 and 6 zeros at the end of the big number on a regular basis, 85% of them run MySQL. And they're saying, well, have this big Oracle Enterprise Manager piece of software, and we want to be able to monitor our MySQL instances. So we now have a way to do that. So this is a list of the work that we've been tackling so far in 5.7, and those numbers are going to rise over the next 3, 4, 5, 6, how many months it takes to get it out the door. We're really conscious about trying to get off as many bugs as we can off our list. So if you bypass using the optimizer and you don't check the syntax and go straight to the storage engine, it's about 9 times faster than going through the SQL. Those of you who might know Facebook's Yoshinori Matsunobu came up with something called Handler Socket about 2, 3 years ago. It was the idea of just bypassing the SQL stack and going right to the data. Very, very fast, but he had some security holes and it wasn't a standard protocol. So our engineers looked at that and said, well, let's use memcached because most of the PHP world uses memcached. The great thing about this approach is that you can see you can do just over 1 million queries per second. That's Yoshinori's benchmark, not ours. And at the same time, someone can come in and hit the same data using SQL. So you can be storing session variables as fast as you need and do some analytics on it on the back end with SQL. Connections per second. We know that a lot of folks measure us by various metrics, but it's for many shops that have customers coming in and out for very short, small periods of time, it's how fast you can get them on and get them off. So we've been working on getting more and more folks on rapidly. I mentioned more about the reason for the cost optimizer. In the past, I had a session yesterday on using explain to look at queries. Don't know how many of you have done it, but it's kind of a nice tabular format that's standard ASCII letters, and it's kind of intimidating for first-time users. Well, we also figured out how to output the same information in JSON, and you can see that on the right-hand side. This tells you exactly why the optimizer is making the choice it makes when it's trying to optimize your queries. We also came up with something called Visual Explain. So for the first time, you can come and see what your query is actually doing and the total cost and why the operations are looping the way they're doing. A lot easier to visually picture what's going on rather than seeing just tons of text information saying what possible keys are out there and what keys it actually used. This, I think, is going to be a big thing for us, a query rewrite plugin. For those of you who are forced to use object relational mappers, you know that sometimes they write the worst, most horrendous SQL code ever. So, since you're kind of stuck using the ORM because it's some sort of corporate dictate, we decided, well, what happens if we set up a way for you to change the query after it's been submitted? So if you know what the bad query looks like, you can now do kind of like a regular expression change of bad to good. Our basic code is kind of messy. One of the problems that we've had early on is that if you send in a bug fix to MySQL, we probably tried to hire you as a programmer. It really kills your code base or your committers if you do that. And over the years, the code got kind of mixed, kludged, messy. So we've been doing a lot of refactoring. And we're trying to make it easier for folks to be able to come up with new modules, new plugins, new ways of doing things. And part of that is having the data dictionary. This is where we're going to have all the information about all the tables in one big meta group where you'll be able to go out and quickly ascertain what's going on that. It's going to be better performant, and once again, you're going to be able to plug in things. So if you come up with a new storage engine, or Luke comes up with a commerce plugin for FoxyCart, we'll be able to put that right in there. A lot of the bigger databases, DB2, Oracle, SQL Server, in some cases, had ways to get down at the low level of what was going on in the system. And MySQL didn't have that till about 5.5 when we came up with something called performance schema. Now we have instrumentation that will let you get down and dig in and see what exactly is going on at the low level. So you can find out who has that lock on that table, who's stealing all your I/O, what queries are running without indexes, what prepared statements are going, which indexes are redundant, and it's all queryable by SQL. Now if you're running MySQL Workbench, one of the later versions, you can actually have a nice graphical interface into looking at all that information. If you want to see that, I can show that to you all later. The only trouble with that is it was kind of complicated. So one of our engineers said, well, why don't I take the, I think it's 170 right now, most common things that people want to look at and prepackage that into a bunch of views and a bunch of stored procedures. So that's what we did with the sys schema, which sits on top of, well, it takes advantage of the performance schema. So this will let you go through and figure out where your I/O hotspots are, where's your locking causing you problems, give you statistics on each of the schemas. And it's equivalent to the $V catalog views and the DMVs in SQL Server world. So now if you really want to know what's going on, we can actually give you that information. Well, disks are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, but we're still finding out that compression helps speed things up for writing and reading. So we've been working on getting the page level compression much more effective. So that reduces the I/O and makes things faster overall. You can now designate some transactions as being high priority. So if you have a boss who's trying to figure out the year-end budget and running a slow query, but meanwhile you have income coming in and you want to keep that high, you can mark that as high. We also have better partitioning. Something that's coming out with 5.7 that's kind of interesting. If you have your data sharded, or you have a bunch of servers and you want to back them all up from one server, you can now use multi-source replication. If you are doing sharding backup, you have to make sure there's no overlaps in your data. But this will let you have one good consistent backup of all your sharded data in one place. The original MySQL replication was single-threaded. It was great, wasn't as robust as it should be, but it worked. And then people said, well, we want it multi-threaded. Okay, well, multi-threaded. Well, we want it multi-threaded within a schema. Well, we now have that. It also works with the binary log group commit, so things will go through much quicker. We're also in 5.6, we came up with something called global transaction ID. So every transaction has its own ID number. In the past, if you were starting up a new replicant slave, you had to go out and find out where the master's position was on its log file from the time you did the backup, position the log file and the slave there, and hopefully they matched up and started things going. Well, global transaction IDs, you just tell the slave, go out to the master and start at transaction number 1 and go until you catch up. There's no having to play the log bing match game. Thank you. How many times have you had to do that recently? Too many. Group replication. We've had a lot of folks say, well, we want active, active, master, 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 or active, never go down, write anywhere, read anywhere type information. So one of the things that we're hoping to get out there with 5.7 is that your application knows there's a group of masters out there, and it writes it to one of them, and all the other ones pick it up. This is something we really need people to go and dance on and try to break. This type of work is very hard to do because you have so many, you're juggling so many balls at the same time and make sure that they all sync up. Usually use the two-phase commit. And when you start doing that with 2 boxes, it's okay. 4 boxes, it gets hairy. 16 boxes, it's crazy. 64 boxes, it's absolutely mayhem. So if you get a chance, please go out and break this for us and let us know what the problems are. Once again, MySQL Fabric is written in Python. It's free. The Python code is very easy to look at and extend. And the idea is your application, Java, PHP, or C, talks to the Fabric connector and said, I want to talk to the partition or the shard that has the Jones information. So the connector gets that information here and goes to whichever box has that information. That box happens to drop offline. Another group fails over. Your connector gets advised that there's been a switch. The idea is your application doesn't have to change, but you can change all this to your heart's content. So Christmas comes up and you need to roll in extra servers for capacity. You can do it. After Christmas, you pull them out. You decide that instead of breaking stuff A to M, N to Z isn't good enough for you, and you want to break it up into thirds or fifths or something like that. You tell this box to reshard, it does it for you. You're not having to do the who has the virtual IP game. This is our recommended strategy for scaling. At the far end, we have a cluster product that if you're never ever going to be down, and that's what you promised your bosses, that's what it will do. The 2 biggest users of that are the gaming industry and cell phones. As you move tower to tower in a cell, they want to be able to track your phone, so the second you hit the little button to send something, they can start billing you faster. The 3rd biggest user is the US Navy for carrier flight operations. They looked at a lot of competing technologies and figured, well, if we're on fire and sinking and we need to take airplanes on and off, this was the best piece of software for that. And by the way, if your user base is able to fly in and land on your roof at 150 miles an hour and drop bombs and has machine guns, you tend to keep your operations rather tight. The first MySQL server I ever ran great for a full weekend, and then I came in and it was dead. I had run it out of log space, and everything was on one disk. So that's the general recommendation of move your logs away from your data disks. And then we had Simon Mudd at Booking.com come in and say, you know, I have all these great tools for syslog. Why should I have to have 2 log grepping programs? So he wrote some code to take the MySQL logs and dump them into syslog. So if you're in that boat, the folks at Booking.com for giving us the code. We've been playing with locking. Sometimes when you're trying to do lock one row, it's not enough. There's other things that go on there. And it's a lot better on deadlocks than in the past. So if you have lots of folks working on the same bits of data, you won't have as much contention. This one is the one you should probably take a snapshot of on your phone and hide for later. If you have a boss that writes really bad queries, what you do is you go to his tilde.my.cnf file and you set this configuration max underscore statement time equals to X number of seconds. So when your boss query runs past that number of seconds, it gets terminated. We're kind of well behind Postgres on graphical information. With 5.7, we've integrated Boost Geometry, and we're active participants in that project. I have a neighboring business that promised me once we had better performance in PostGIS, they'd get me a case of beer. Well, 4 months ago, I put 5.7 on their test box, and I'm happy to say I'm 4 beers into that case. A lot of folks right now are writing a lot of code that's designed to go to a mobile app. And the mobile engines don't really have enough horsepower to do a lot of the really neat stuff that you can do with a web browser. So our engineers started going, well, how about if we put stuff in JSON and send it over HTTP and pipe it down to these phones or these other light devices? So it speeds up the processing or the endpoint view for what the folks are getting. And you can do regular SQL, you can do CRUD, or you can do JSON documents. MySQL Workbench, if you're not using this and you're maintaining a MySQL server and you don't have the enterprise manager, you need to take a look at this. It's free, it's an entity relationship mapper, it's a query tool, it's an admin tool, and it's a godsend. In a PHP crowd, I'd like to mention that if you're running PHP MyAdmin and you haven't had a script kiddie spend hours and hours trying to guess your password to get into PHP MyAdmin, it's very frightening because sometimes they guess right. This is a client, connects to the server, so the server can be on your box, it can be down the road, it can be somewhere on the net, doesn't really matter. And it runs on Macs, it runs on Windows, and it runs on Unix or Linux. I mentioned earlier that we have community repositories. Just about everything we have you can get out there, and we're working on pre-configured containers. And if you want our source code, it's on GitHub. As I mentioned, we have a cluster product. It's designed for no single point of failure, which means you have to make sure there's no single point of failure in your network or the rest of your operations setup. We're constantly making it faster because the cell phone companies and the gaming companies love it. One of the big features for it is it's active between data centers. So if you need something on the West Coast, something on the East Coast, and something in Tokyo, and you need to keep them all in sync, and they all have to have the same data at the same time, and you don't want them to go down more than 10 minutes a year, this is your product. Security. We've done a lot in security. In the past, if you were on Amazon and you said, okay, I want a MySQL server out there, boom, it was out there. There was an anonymous account, the root account had no password, and there was a test database that people could inject stuff into. Now when you do an install, it assigns a password that you have to look up under /root.mysql password. Makes life a lot easier. We also have ways to force users to rotate passwords. If you have applications using your server, please don't enforce that on that account unless your application knows how to change a password and tell everyone else it's changed the password. Performance schema. We now have 200 plus instruments to go over and let you look at what's going on. Schema, as I mentioned earlier, I can show you that with Workbench later if anyone's interested. Replication. Original MySQL replication was asynchronous. The master had a file, the slave came along and read it, master had no idea if the slave actually had done anything with it. With 5.6, we had semi-sync replication. The idea was that at least one of the slaves who getting the data said, yes, I have a copy of the data. I may not have written it to disk, but I do have a copy of it, so Mr. Master, you can go on to the next transaction you're trying to do. Well, now we've added checksums and got tables for monitoring it. And we also now have dynamic replication filters. So suddenly you realize something's going wrong and you want to start replicating the data off to another server because your main slave is going to be taken offline or is acting flaky. You can do that on the fly. Also, please check out the PECL extension MySQL_ND_MS. If you're doing read-write splitting, one of the things it does is it knows which of the read slaves is least loaded and will redirect your query to that box. Once again, multi-threaded slaves. So here's the stuff we're going to do in 5.7 that's going to cause heartburn. In the past, if you were doing grouping and one of the groups wasn't explicitly named in your query, the optimizer would guess, and sometimes it didn't guess right. And now we're making it work like other databases. Replication, we're making it more durable. In the past, replication information was kept in a file. A system crash, the file gets corrupted, you have problems. Now we don't want to store all that information in InnoDB. InnoDB knows how to recover itself after a crash. So when something does go wrong, replication can rebuild itself just the way InnoDB rebuilds itself. We want to get rid of the show engine InnoDB mutix. By the way, if you use any of these on a regular basis in the next couple slides, please let me know. We have the same information in performance schema. It was kind of a MySQLism. We also get rid of the we want to deprecate the monitor tables for InnoDB. And it's very old code. It goes back to 10 years ago when we started using InnoDB. This is the one that's going to bite the folks running WordPress. In the past, MySQL has taken a lot of heat for being able to do nasty things to your data when you committed it. We have a Sql Mode level that you can say, okay, I want to be very tolerant of problems, to I want it to be very strict, and we're going to put strict on by default. For instance, if you had 32 characters going to a 30-character field, you'd get a warning if you weren't running strict mode, and it would truncate off the last 2 characters. Well, 80% of the time that's great, but 20% of the time you don't want to lose those last 2 characters. So under strict mode, if you're trying to put 5 pounds into a 3-pound bag, you're going to get an error. But you can reconfigure this. We want to get rid of explain partitions and explain extended. I don't know how many of you folks use that. The information's out there now with visual explain. Alter ignore table. This was something that very rarely was used. It's kind of messy and it kind of screwed up data on time, and we're deprecating it. Query cache. One of the neat things used to be about MySQL is that if you're running the same query and query over, the optimizer would stop and say, well, let me go to my single-threaded query cache and see if I already have the results out there, so I don't have to do the computations. I can just send out the information. Well, as time has gone on, that hasn't been scaled. The query cache is still single-threaded. It's kind of messy to make it multi-threaded. And most folks who are doing the same query and over and over and over and over again are either throwing that in something like a memcached or Redis cache, or they're putting it in their application. So with 5.6, we disabled it, and we're planning to quietly sneak it away off into the days of history. If you looked at output from MySQL dump, we designated nulls by a /N. This was kind of a shorthand from the early days. Well, there's only one person who still uses that. Unfortunately, he's one of our founders and has his own fork of MySQL. And we haven't found anyone else who uses it. So if you are using this, please let me know. Federated merge storage engines. Federated came about because the federated department stores, which are now, I think, long gone, used to have multiple servers and they wanted to query them as one. Worked okay in the MyISAM days, doesn't work too well now, so we're turning that off. Merge storage engine was kind of a niche niche product that never really took off the way we wanted, and we don't really have any paying customers who are using it, and we kind of hard to find non-paying customers who are using it. So if you're using it, let me know. I'd like to make a user case for you. See how many of you are actually awake this morning. Temp tables. Depending on how you set up your InnoDB, everything is either in one big table or every table has their own little table. There's some overhead problems there, and especially if you're doing a lot of temp table work. So if you're doing a lot of temp table work, what we're doing is we're moving you off into your own little universe so those temp tables don't affect the other tables. Triggers. In the Oracle world especially, people put a lot of logic into the database. In the MySQL world in the past, a lot of the logic is above the database level. That's the way I like to do it. To me, it's cleaner. But there are some folks who like using triggers. Triggers allow you to capture data that's going to be overwritten. So like you have a customer who's changing their address, but you want to record what their old address is just in case. You can use a trigger to say, okay, take their old address and throw it in the old address table for us. It used to be you could have one trigger per table. Now you can have multiple triggers. Error logging. As I mentioned earlier, my first server I managed to kill over a weekend because the log filled up. Now you can change the verbosity. You can have it log just errors, errors and warnings, errors, warning, and any notes. You can do this, change this on the fly. So if you have something going wrong and you want to find out what's different, you can up the level of warnings. This is a hard slide for some folks. The folks at MariaDB especially, I've had this slide in my deck for 2.5 years. They've claimed they've never seen any of this. What we're trying to do is we're trying to carry MySQL into the future. Well, what's the future? Well, everyone's telling us it's more and more web, more and more cloud-based, and a whole bunch of embedded stuff. To help us get there, we're trying to simplify our architecture, because right now it's a dog's dinner of various kludges that we're refactoring out, but it takes time to do that. So, if you're curious about MySQL, obvious place to start is mysql.com. You can also download anything that you want from dev.mysql.com. Now, if you're curious about the stuff that we actually charge money for, we have a better backup tool, we have a better monitoring tool, we have a couple other things that you can play with, and those are available for free for 30 days from edelivery.oracle.com. For roughly what you're going to pay for a seat of SQL Server per month or Word for a year, you can actually get these high-performance tools and a neck to choke and a phone number for the person whose neck you're going to choke. If you have folks in your office who are trying to figure out how to learn MySQL cheaply, Boston MySQL Users Group has MySQL Marinate. It's a free online virtual class. You work through a chapter at your own pace. It used to be a chapter a week, but now they've kind of uncoupled that. You upload your homework, and Mozilla's senior DBA will double check your work. If that's not a good option for you, you want something more classroom-like, check to see if there's a Girl Develop It chapter in your area. These folks are open to more than just girls, and it's fairly cheap. Their most popular class is MySQL and PHP. So if you have folks coming into your environment who are good folks but don't know either, please send them to these. I think they charge $20 for 2 4-hour classes. Please, if you need to contact me, get a hold of me this week. That's my email. I'm fairly easy to find on the internet. And I'm open for any questions we have because we have 20 minutes before I have to clear out. So, God, you're a quiet group. Yes, sir.
You were talking about MySQL Factor. I tried hospitals, and you didn't really cut it because it was a weight perspective. How do you compare specifically those two? And I believe it's
Well, to be honest, MySQL cluster is like a top fuel drag racer. It's great if you need to go 0 to 300 miles an hour, but going down to the local store to buy a gallon of milk, it's the wrong tool. Cluster is probably going to end up being somewhere halfway between read-write splitting and cluster. You can have multiple fabric controllers. So on the picture up there, we saw the one box that everyone's talking to. You can have multiples of those. The great thing about fabric is you're going to have failover in a couple seconds. MySQL cluster, you're going to have sub-second failover. So it depends on how much time you can plan to have down. The other great thing about fabric is it's easy to reshard and shard. Cluster, it's a little trickier to shard and reshard, but you can still do it.
Would it be possible to run only two controllers or masters using fabric?
Should be able to, yeah. Yeah. That's one of the things that, like I said, it's only been out since May, and we're asking people to go stomp on it so we find out where it breaks. So please go out, try it. If it doesn't work for what you want, let me know, and we'll talk to the engineers. Yes, sir.
On the master replication.
Yeah.
What's the availability to read or write, and how is that all balanced out?
I haven't had a chance to play with it. The code for that came out in the last DMR a month ago, and I've been home exactly 8 days. So I haven't had a chance to play with it. So I honestly can just give you a swag, but I honestly would rather say I honestly don't know. I haven't played with it, haven't broken it yet. So, well, and by the way, if you're interested or you know someone looking for a job, Oracle is hiring. We're especially looking for Python coders and C++ coders, but then we're also looking for marketing types, QA types, support folks. So if you know anyone who's looking, please let them know. Yes, sir.
I noticed that the MySQL certifications are fairly new, and I see an EBA certification study guide came out. Do you have any plans for releasing a developer study guide?
I used to be the certification manager for MySQL AB and then for MySQL and Sun. When the new certifications came out, I reviewed a couple of questions, but I wasn't actively involved. So when the beta exams came up, I signed up, and I went and took it, and it damn near kicked my ass. It's a more comprehensive exam than in the past, but it's only one exam instead of 2 to get the DBA certification. The certification guide is being written by someone I honestly don't know. I've asked the publisher for some information in pre-release, but the book's been delayed from this month to next February or March, so I know absolutely nothing about the book. For the developer, I don't know what they have in plans. The publisher is kind of very closed-mouthed. What Oracle normally does is they don't talk about anything until it has a price and a product code to ship out. That being said, in the old days, our documentation team used to write the certification guides, and unfortunately, they're too busy to do that. So right now, it's kind of in a nebulous area, but I can tell you, it's a test you walk out of at the end of the time, and you pretty well feel stretched, molded, and smashed. It's very comprehensive. One of my counterparts who took the developer test also said it was similar. So,
Do you have any advice on how to prepare for the study?
when you look at the syllabus of what the material they have there, read through the man pages for what they're talking about, and then type in all the examples and work through them. That's probably the best advice I have. And hopefully the manuals, when it comes out, hopefully we'll have both of them, they'll both be so excellent, it's kind of like just after spamming it in your head by osmosis, you'll have it all done. So, and good luck, and thank you for trying it. So what about this half of the room? Any questions, or all the questionnaires over here?
Can you put your slides online?
They'll be on slideshare.net tonight.
So much meat in there, it's kind of like, there's a lot that's been done.
Well, it's one of those things where I want to put so much in there that folks will download it so they just don't have to try to remember or take pictures of what I had. So, yeah. Anyone? I saw another hand. Yes, sir.
So you're saying we should go for cache?
My favorite thing for the past several releases is turn off query cache and use that memory someplace else. And if you have a query that you're running all the time, either store the information in your application, so like sports scores or something like that, or put it in a cache like Redis or Memcached. Yes, sir.
I thought object hashing or minimizing all your functionality could be useful if you have really old in any longer consideration.
Yeah, unfortunately the big trouble is the optimizer is trying to do everything as fast as it can, and then it has to go to this single-threaded path. Oh, have I run this before, and is it sitting out there in the cache? And in my experience, it's been easier just to turn it off and put it in a real cache. So, yes, sir?
What's the cost of letting a performance schema activate in cache?
What's the cost of? Uh-huh. Yeah. If you need to look at the information, it's invaluable. The folks at Percona, not MySQL, Percona, one of our frenemies or our local competition, they're saying it's somewhere between 3 and 6%. And they're recommending to their customers to leave it on because it's so valuable to get to it. If you're really at a point where you need that last 3 to 6%, you probably ought to look at scaling somehow. If anyone wants to see Workbench and how it looks at the performance schema stuff in the sys tables, let me know. I'll show you that later. It's amazing the amount of detail you can get that tells you what's going on. So you can find out, gee, the server's running slow. Who's got a query going? Ah, the boss is running his album cataloging program again. So let's see how we do that. Any? Okay. Unofficially, coming up the Oracle on here, Percona is very good. The open source database world is very small and very incestuous. That includes Postgres and a lot of the other ones. So I tend not to try to speak bad of someone because you never know who's going to be your boss next quarter. That being said, Oracle is very big, but we can't be everywhere. Therefore, companies like Percona can come in and do a great job. Peter Zaitsev is brilliant. There's none of his staff that I think are lacking. I highly recommend Bill Carwin's SQL anti-pattern book. He's now a MySQL ace, which means we recognize his contribution. Percona does some wonderful things. They can be in places we can't. They contribute code back to us. Politically, it's kind of a touchy subject with some of my bosses because, damn it, everyone should be buying everything from Oracle, period. But we realize that we can't be everywhere. Maria is kind of an interesting business plan. They've been having some nasty shuffles the past year and a half, 18 months so. One of the problems is they say they're plug-in compatible. Well, they're not anymore. As of 10.1, they're not. They didn't like what we did with GTIDs, so they rewrote their GTIDs, which means if you have mixed Maria and MySQL or mixed Maria, Percona and MySQL, you can't replicate through their boxes. If you go out and read their developer blogs, they're having a hard time keeping up with what we're doing. We have 250 engineers, they have 6. Monty says they're 30 man-years ahead of what we're doing, but a lot of what we're doing is getting rid of the old cruft that was left in there. Monty also a year ago came up to me at a conference and said, I've done a study, there's only 12 people at Oracle working on the server. No, I know the main optimizer team is 25, and I know the storage engine team is twice that. What makes you say that, Monty? I've looked at the folks who've committed in the past 2 weeks, and there's only 12 of them. Okay. That being said, I'm very grateful for Monty for starting MySQL, but a lot of the FUD that he spreads about us is disheartening and not really worthy of him. Something we're working on is next year is the 20th anniversary of MySQL, and it's also the 10th anniversary of InnoDB. And we're trying to figure out how we're going to celebrate this. What events are we going to bring cake to? So if you have ideas on that, please let me know. So, anything else? This side of the room. Can it say English? Never mind. Well, yes, sir. Support for the CIDR addresses. Well, we used to have this nice little hack for doing IP4 addresses. And I know our engineers are on top of that, but I don't know what the plans are. They keep me away from those discussions for a purpose because I'm a blabbermouth, because that's part of my job. I know we have to do something for the CIDR addresses. Hopefully it's as simple as a little function like the old inet adder function. So. Boy, you are a quiet group. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming out. If you have any questions, get a hold of me. Oh, yeah, Workbench. Oh, you want to see Workbench? Let me... My old laptop here has only one USB port, and I got permission last week to order a new one. Okay, we used to have two tools, a query tool and an admin tool many, many years ago, and they were kind of lacking. And 3 or 4 years ago, we bought rights to a program and started changing it and calling it MySQL Workbench. The folks who work on this team are absolutely amazing. I look at their work logs, and the features they're adding on a regular basis are staggering. And this takes a little bit to load on my machine because I'm running 2 instances of MySQL and a whole bunch of other stuff in the background. So, first part of Workbench is an Eer Mapper. And your friend calls you up and says, hey, can you come over? I've got a new product with a new database, and I don't understand any of this. I don't think I know how any of this plugs together, and it's a big mess, and there's no documentation with it. So I can come in with this tool, and it will draw me a nice entity relationship map. So I can come in here, and it will show me what the various parts of the table are, which tables relate to whom, and it will show me the indexes on that table. And if I need to make a change, so like emails are 35 characters, and you have people with 60-character emails. You can change that and roll it back out, which I find very useful. Second part is as an admin tool. How many of you folks have ever set up a MySQL account with multiple grants by hand? How many times did you make mistakes doing the _priv equals single quote uppercase Y, single quote comma? It's a nasty thing to have to type. So now if you have a new user, you come in here and you can set limits for how much time they can use and all that. But rather than typing all this stuff over here with grant _ delete, drop, event, execute, whatever, since we don't have the idea of roles within MySQL, you can come in here and click and get the various permissions for you, writes it out really nicely. It has a performance dashboard to tell you what's going on with the system. It's kind of quiet now, but you see all sorts of little graphs popping up. Now, if you want to look at the performance schema, I can now come in here, and I can look at the I/O, who's using what I/O, what files are being opened, what's going on, the buffer stats. I have access to the MySQL Utilities. So I can do, there's like 17 utilities out there that do everything from checking unused indexes to saying, here's my master, here's 3 new slaves, copy everything off here onto these slaves. The master goes away, one of these slaves will self-promote to become the new master. They're all written in Python, and they're all very nice. I can come in and I can change all the server settings, look at the logs, change my options. But if I have a query, let me use our infamous world database. If I type something wrong, it will tell me with that little red that there's some minor syntax problem there. But I can go through and execute the query. Now what's really cool for an old timer, oops. Why aren't I getting, oh, this is tabular explain. This is the old-fashioned explain. This tells me exactly what the optimizer is trying to do. If you're an old dinosaur like me, this is like a monochrome IBM PCXT. It's familiar, it's not very fast, not very brilliant, not very dazzling. But with the same information in a much prettier format, I can get the same information. And I don't know about you, but I like looking at that better than the old tabular format. Once again, this is free, runs on Linux, runs on Macs, runs on Windows. If you have something that doesn't run on, let me know. But this is probably the best free tool we have out there after the server, and it's our second most popular download. Boy, you are a quiet bunch. Okay. Well, if there's nothing else, thank you all for, oops, yes, sir.
Maybe talk a little more about that SQL mode.
The default SQL mode? The default SQL mode is going to be strict, which has, now I have to go back to the slides. Has some other where is it? Oh, by the way, we have Chinese GB 18030 character set support in 5.7. Don't know how many of you need that, but we are the only major database that have that. Back to strict mode. This is going to be our new default. It will keep you from doing most of the stuff that people do to stamp on their own feet. Get rid of all the division for zero stuff, not let you put in a blank date, all that sort of thing. Do you have a specific question? Or?
Actually, I was asking about the group by.
Oh, the group by.
The node zero date is probably better than our SQL Server DBAs and data from MySQL. They said they're actually at 0 days.
Yeah. Yeah. Morgan Talker, who's my counterpart from Canada, has a wonderful blog on this. If you're doing a group by and one of the fields that you mention isn't being grouped on, MySQL will move stuff around on you in unpredictable ways, things that would shift over time. So if you can come to me later, I'll find the blog for you that he has. It's one of those things where we were doing it the way differently from everybody else, so now we're doing it the way everybody else is. So.
Does this mean that I know SQL Server gets very upset if you don't select the column that you're grouping on?
Yeah, that's the idea, yeah. Because a lot of folks do group by A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and that can get messy. And we kind of went our own way, and now we're paying for our sins. Yes, sir. In your config mode, just have SQL mode equals double quote, semicolon. To change it to something else, in the configuration file, just change the SQL underscore mode into equals single, double quote, semicolon.
What is if I have old data application and I don't want to break it, just leave it out?
Yeah. No. No. The best analog I can give you is probably well before your time. Originally, when they started mandating seatbelts, there was nothing that went ding, 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 ding to tell you that you had to put on your seatbelt. Several years down the line, we might have the equivalent of the buzzer telling you need to put your seatbelt on. But if you have something that's very old and you want to turn it off, please do so. But be aware in the future, or at the present time, something might bite you in the butt because you're not carefully screening your data. Well, thank you all very much. Davey Shafik is up next in this room talking about the new features in PHP 5. He's a wonderful lecturer. His last name isn't Stokes, so they didn't keep the theme going. So, but thank you all for coming out.